The auction hall smelled of old coffee and desperation. Marcus Chen sat in the third row, his calloused hands folded in his lap, dirt still visible under his fingernails despite an hour of scrubbing that morning. He'd driven 4 hours from his failing farm in Kern County to attend this foreclosure auction in downtown Los Angeles, leaving before dawn to make the 10 o'clock start time. Around him, real estate developers in expensive suits scrolled through their phones, their disinterest palpable. This wasn't the kind of auction that attracted serious money. The properties up for sale today were the leftovers, the disasters, the buildings so damaged or problematic that even bargain hunters had passed them over in previous sales. Marcus was 47 years old, though the sun and hard work had aged him beyond that. His face was weathered, lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting across fields under harsh light. His hands told the story of 3 decades farming the same 40 acres his grandfather had worked, the same land that was now 6 months behind on taxes and facing seizure. The drought had destroyed him. 3 years without adequate rain had turned his almond orchard into a graveyard of skeletal trees. His equipment was breaking down faster than he could repair it. His wife had left 2 years ago, unable to watch their dreams crumble into dust. His daughter Sarah, 19 and studying agricultural science at Fresno State, believed her father could turn things around. Marcus wasn't sure he shared her faith, but he couldn't let her down. Not yet. He'd come to this auction with a desperate plan. Buy something cheap, anything with potential, flip it fast, and use the profit to save the farm. It was the kind of reckless gamble a younger man might make, but Marcus was out of options. The auctioneer, a thin man in his 60s with a voice worn smooth by decades of selling other people's failures, tapped his microphone. Next item. The Grandview Hotel, 1247, Wilshire Boulevard. Built 1929, 12 stories, approximately 80,000 square feet. Property condemned following the 2019 earthquake. Severe structural damage, asbestos present, multiple code violations. Sold as is, no warranties, no inspections permitted prior to sale. A grainy photograph appeared on the screen behind him. The Grandview had once been magnificent, an Art Deco masterpiece with soaring lines and elegant details. In the photo, it was a ruin. The top 3 floors had partially collapsed during the earthquake. Windows were shattered, the facade cracked and crumbling. Scaffolding surrounded the building like a cage, and warning signs covered every entrance. This property requires immediate demolition. The auctioneer continued flatly. Buyer is responsible for all demolition costs, estimated at $2 to $3 million. Environmental remediation required due to asbestos. Property sold with no access to interior prior to demolition. City has placed a lien for $400,000 in unpaid citations and hazard fees. Marcus leaned forward. The building was a disaster, clearly. But downtown Los Angeles real estate, even a lot cleared of debris, had to be worth something. The land alone in this location could sell for millions. Starting bid is $50,000, the auctioneer said. Do I have $50,000? Silence. Marcus looked around the room. No one moved. $40,000? The auctioneer tried, his tone suggesting he expected nothing. More silence. A man in the front row actually laughed. Marcus's mind raced. He had $62,000 in cash. Every penny he'd managed to scrape together by selling his tractor, his truck, and borrowing against his life insurance. It was supposed to be enough to buy something small, a house maybe, that he could rehab and flip. But a downtown lot, even one requiring expensive demolition, that could be worth 10 times what he'd invested. $30,000? The auctioneer's voice carried a note of resignation. Marcus raised his hand. 30,000. Every head in the room turned. He felt their stares, heard the whispers. Someone behind him muttered, "Is he serious?" The auctioneer looked surprised. "I have $30,000. Do I hear $35,000? 35. A voice called from the back. Marcus turned to see a man in an expensive suit, mid-40s, with the kind of confidence that came from old money. He was smiling slightly, the way someone might smile at a dog performing a silly trick. Marcus's stomach tightened. He couldn't afford a bidding war. 40,000. The suited man's smile widened. 50, 60,000, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He was all in now. This was everything. The suited man studied him for a long moment, then shook his head and sat back, his expression dismissive. It's yours, farmer. Enjoy your death trap. Laughter rippled through the room. Marcus felt heat rise to his face, but kept his eyes forward. Sold, the auctioneer said, bringing down the gavel. $60,000 to bidder number 47. Marcus sat frozen as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him. He'd just spent everything he had on a condemned building he wasn't allowed to inspect that would cost millions to demolish, that everyone in this room thought was worthless. The clerk called him to the front after the auction ended. She was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who processed his payment with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd seen every kind of foolish decision. You understand you're buying this as is? No refunds, no claims against the city for any reason. I understand, Marcus said quietly. Demolition permit is already approved. You've got 6 months to bring the building down, or the city will do it and bill you double. She stamped his receipt. The property's been sealed since the earthquake. Here's the only key we have. It opens the main entrance, though God knows what you'll find inside. Nobody's been in there for 5 years. She handed him a single tarnished brass key. Good luck. You're going to need it. Marcus walked out into the afternoon sun, the key heavy in his pocket, and pulled out his phone. He needed to call Sarah to explain what he'd done. But as he stared at her number, he couldn't bring himself to dial. What would he say? That he'd gambled their last hope on a building everyone else knew was worthless? Instead, he got in his borrowed car, an ancient Honda that belonged to his neighbor, and drove toward Wilshire Boulevard to see what he'd actually bought. The Grandview Hotel rose against the sky like a monument to better days gone wrong. Marcus parked across the street and sat for a long time just looking at it. The Art Deco facade, once elegant, was now a warning. Deep cracks ran through the concrete. The upper floors tilted at a slight angle, enough to make his stomach uneasy. Yellow caution tape wrapped the perimeter, and signs declared the building unsafe, condemned, and subject to demolition. But there was something about the bones of it, the way it had been built with ambition and craftsmanship from another era. The stone carvings around the entrance, though damaged, were beautiful. The brass fixtures, now green with age, had been expensive once. Someone had dreamed this building into existence, had believed it would stand forever. Marcus crossed the street and approached the entrance. The chain-link fence had a gap where vandals had cut through. He slipped inside, his heart pounding. This was technically illegal, he knew. The property was condemned. But it was his now, wasn't it? The brass key fit the main entrance, though the lock was stiff with disuse. Marcus had to throw his shoulder against the door to force it open. It gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty lobby. He stepped inside and stopped, his breath catching. The lobby was vast, 2 stories tall, with a domed ceiling that had once been painted with murals. Water damage had turned the paintings into ghostly shadows, but you could still see the shapes of angels and clouds, Art Deco sunbursts, and geometric patterns. A grand staircase swept upward, its marble steps cracked but intact. Chandeliers hung dark and dusty, their crystals dulled but still present. Debris covered the floor, plaster that had fallen from the ceiling, broken furniture, years of accumulated dust. But underneath the decay, Marcus could see what the Grandview had been. Elegant, ambitious, built to last. He walked deeper into the lobby, his footsteps echoing. The registration desk still stood, though its brass fittings had been stripped by scavengers. Behind it, pigeonhole mailboxes lined the wall, each one numbered, most still containing yellowed papers and forgotten mail. To his left, a sign pointed to the restaurant and ballroom. To his right, the elevator bank, its doors frozen open, revealing empty shafts that descended into darkness. Straight ahead, the grand staircase. Marcus pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The building had no power, and the afternoon sun barely penetrated the grime-covered windows. He climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step. The marble was solid, The construction sound despite the earthquake damage. The second floor held guest rooms, dozens of them, their doors hanging open or missing entirely. He walked down the corridor, shining his light into each room. Most were stripped bare, anything valuable long since stolen. But some still contained furniture, beds with rotted mattresses, dressers with mirrors somehow unbroken, evidence of lives briefly lived in rooms now returned to silence. At the end of the hallway, he found a larger suite. The door bore a tarnished brass plaque. Presidential suite. Marcus pushed it open. This room was different. Someone had sealed it, locked it from the inside maybe, because it looked untouched by the scavengers who'd picked the rest of the building clean. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its linens gray with dust but still present. A sitting area held a couch and chairs arranged around a cold fireplace. And along one wall, a bar with bottles still lined up behind it, their labels faded but recognizable. Expensive liquor from decades past. Marcus walked to the window and looked out over Los Angeles. Even through the filthy glass, the view was incredible. The city sprawled in every direction, millions of lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. From up here, you could almost forget the building was condemned, almost imagine what it must have been like when the Grand View was the finest hotel in the city. His phone rang. Sarah. He answered, trying to keep his voice steady. Hey, honey. Dad, where are you? I've been calling all day. I'm in L.A. Had some business to handle. What kind of business? Her voice carried that mix of love and worry he'd grown used to hearing. Dad, please tell me you didn't do anything crazy. Marcus looked around the presidential suite, at the decay and the faded grandeur, and made a decision. I bought a building. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, what kind of building? A hotel. Downtown L.A. It needs work, but the location's good. I'm going to flip it. Sarah, use the profit to save the farm. Dad. Her voice was small now, frightened. How much work does it need? Some, he admitted. Okay, a lot. It's condemned, actually. Has to be demolished. You bought a condemned building? Sarah's voice rose. With what money? Dad, please tell me you didn't spend everything we had. It's going to be okay, Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The land alone is worth millions. I just need to handle the demolition, clean up the lot, and sell it. 6 months, maybe less. We'll be fine. Dad, demolition costs a fortune. How are you going to pay for it? That was the question, wasn't it? Marcus had $2,000 left after the purchase. Demolition would cost millions. He had no answer that made sense. I'll figure out, he said quietly. I always do. Sarah was crying now. Dad, please come home. We can talk to the bank again, work something out. You don't have to save everything by yourself. I'm not coming home until I fix this, Marcus said. I love you, honey. Trust me just a little longer. He hung up before she could argue further, before his own doubt could overwhelm him. That night, Marcus slept in his car parked outside the Grandview. He couldn't afford a hotel, and the building itself was too dangerous to sleep in, despite the temptation of all those empty rooms. He dozed fitfully, waking every few hours to the sound of sirens or the shuffle of homeless people passing by. In the morning, stiff and aching, he bought coffee from a street vendor and sat on the curb across from his building, trying to formulate a plan. He needed to find a demolition contractor willing to work on credit or delay payment. He needed to understand what permits he still required. He needed to inspect the building properly and assess the real cost of bringing it down. What he really needed was a miracle. By mid-morning, Marcus had made a dozen calls to demolition companies. The responses ranged from incredulous laughter to blunt refusal. A condemned 12-story building with asbestos and earthquake damage? That was a $3 million job minimum, and nobody was doing it on credit for a farmer from Kern County with no construction background. He was on his 15th call, growing desperate when someone tapped his shoulder. Marcus turned to find an elderly man, maybe 70, wearing a maintenance worker's uniform and carrying a coffee. You the one who bought the Grandview? The old man asked. Marcus nodded warily. That's me. Thought so. So you going in yesterday? I'm Roberto Martinez. Worked maintenance at the Grandview for 32 years before they shut it down after the quake. It was your building, Marcus said. Felt like mine, yeah. Hurt to see it fall apart like this. Roberto gestured toward the condemned structure. Mind if I ask what you're planning to do with her? Demolish it, Marcus said quietly. Sell the land. It's the only play that makes sense. Roberto's face fell. Yeah, I figured. Still hurts to hear it. He took a sip of coffee. The Grandview was special once. You know it hosted 3 presidents? Marilyn Monroe stayed here. So did Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, all the big names. That ballroom hosted weddings and galas. During the war, soldiers came here on leave. The lobby bar never closed, not for 40 years straight. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and meant it. I don't have much choice. The building's beyond saving. Roberto nodded slowly. Yeah, probably. But if you're planning to demo it, there's something you should know. Something they don't have in the city records. Marcus's attention sharpened. What kind of something? A penthouse, Roberto said quietly. Real penthouse. Not like the presidential suite on the 2nd floor. Top floor, hidden access. The owner built it for himself back in 1930. Sealed it off during the war and never reopened it. After he died in '62, the building changed hands so many times everybody forgot it was there. It's not on the modern blueprints, not in the city database. But it's there, and it's sealed tight. Never got looted because nobody knew about it. Marcus's pulse quickened. How do you know about it? Because the owner told me. I started working here in 1987, and he was ancient by then, 90-something, but sharp as a tack. He made me promise never to tell anyone about the penthouse. Said what was up there needed to stay hidden. I kept that promise for 62 years. But now the building's coming down anyway, so I figure the secret dies with it unless somebody goes up there first. Is there anything valuable up there? Marcus tried to keep the desperation out of his voice. Roberto shrugged. Don't know. Never been inside. The old man said there was a safe, personal belongings, things from before the war. Could be junk. Could be treasure. But if you're tearing the place down anyway, might as well look first. How do I access it? Elevator shaft. There's a maintenance ladder that goes all the way up. But the penthouse floor doesn't have a regular entrance. You have to climb through a hatch in the elevator shaft ceiling on the 12th floor. Tricky, maybe dangerous with the earthquake damage, but doable if you're careful. Marcus looked up at the Grandview at the damaged upper floors. The top 3 floors partially collapsed. Penthouse is built different. Reinforced concrete, separate from the regular floors. It might have held. Won't know till you look. Roberto pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This is a sketch of the elevator shaft. Shows where the hatch is. The old man drew it for me 40 years ago. Never thought I'd actually use it. Marcus took the paper carefully. Why are you telling me this? Roberto met his eyes. Because you looked at this building the same way I always did. Not like it's garbage to be cleared away, but like it was something once. Something worth remembering. If there's anything up in that penthouse, anything that tells the Grandview story, I want it preserved. Not buried in a landfill. He finished his coffee and turned to leave, then paused. Be careful in there. Building's unstable. And whatever you find, if you find anything, remember the Grandview was built by dreamers. They might have left their dreams behind. Marcus spent the rest of the day preparing. He bought a decent flashlight, work gloves, a dust mask, and a small backpack. He found a hardware store and purchased bolt cutters for any locks he might encounter and a rope in case the maintenance ladder was damaged. As the sun set, he stood across from the Grandview one more time, studying the upper floors. The damage was concentrated on floors 10 through 12, where the earthquake had hit hardest. But Roberto had said the penthouse was separate, reinforced. If it had survived, if there's really something up there, this could change everything. Or it could be nothing. An empty room with worthless junk, and he'd have risked his life climbing through a condemned building for fantasy. But Marcus had already gambled everything. What was one more risk? He waited until full dark, until the street traffic thinned, then slipped through the gap in the chain-link fence and used his key on the main entrance. The door groaned open, and he stepped into the black silence of the Grandview's lobby. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the disturbed air. Everything looked different at night, more threatening, more alien. Shadows filled the corners, and every sound echoed wrong. Marcus made his way to the elevator bank, found a shaft Roberto had marked on his sketch. The doors were jammed half open. He squeezed through into the shaft itself, his flashlight revealing a vertical tunnel that climbed up into darkness. The elevator car was gone, probably removed during the initial earthquake assessment. But the maintenance ladder was there, bolted to the concrete wall, stretching up through 12 floors. Marcus tested the first rung. Solid. He began to climb. The ascent was grueling. Marcus's arms burned by the 3rd floor. His legs trembled by the 6th. He'd spent years doing farm work, but this was different, every muscle strained and protesting. He forced himself to keep moving, one rung at a time, not looking down at the black void below. By the time he reached the 12th floor, sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. He hooked his arm through the ladder and rested, breathing hard, shining his light around the shaft. There, above him, exactly where Roberto's sketch indicated, a metal hatch set into the concrete ceiling, secured with a padlock that looked decades old. Marcus pulled out the bolt cutters and reached up awkwardly, one arm still hooked through the ladder. It took 3 tries, his hands shaking from exhaustion, but the old lock finally snapped. He pushed the hatch open. A rush of stale air hit him, musty and thick, the smell of a space sealed for over 60 years. Marcus pulled himself up through the hatch, his arms screaming in protest, and emerged into darkness. He swung his flashlight around. He was in a small vestibule, concrete walls, no windows. A single door stood ahead of him, heavy metal, sealed with 3 separate locks. Marcus approached it slowly, his heart pounding. The locks were old but sophisticated, the kind that would require keys he didn't have. He examined them closely. They were corroded, the metal eaten away by time and moisture that had somehow penetrated even the sealed space. He used the bolt cutters on each lock. They broke easier than the hatch lock had, decades of rust making them brittle. The 3rd lock snapped, and Marcus stood before the door, his hand on the handle. This was it. Whatever was behind this door, whatever the original owner had sealed away in 1942 and never retrieved, he was about to be the first person to see it in over 60 years. Marcus pulled the door open. His flashlight beam revealed a large room, maybe 50 feet across, and it was full, furniture covered in white sheets, wooden crates stacked along the walls, filing cabinets, dozens of them, a massive desk in the center, and along the far wall, built into the concrete, a huge safe. The old-fashioned kind, at least 6 feet tall, with a combination dial and heavy wheel lock. Marcus stepped inside, his legs weak. The penthouse was intact. The earthquake hadn't touched it. Everything Roberto had said was true. He moved to the nearest crate and pried off the lid carefully. Inside, packed in straw, were bottles. Wine, champagne, liquor. He pulled one out gently and wiped away the dust. A bottle of French wine, the label faded but legible. 1928. The next crate held more bottles. The 3rd contained books, first editions, leather-bound, some with signatures on the title pages. The 4th held photographs in frames, images from the 1920s and 30s, Hollywood stars and politicians, all signed with personal messages. Marcus's hands shook as he opened crate after crate. Paintings wrapped in cloth, jewelry in velvet boxes, antique cameras, crystal glassware, silver serving sets, items that spoke of wealth and taste from a bygone era. But all of this was nothing compared to the safe. It dominated the far wall, imposing and solid. A brass plaque above the dial read, "Excelsior Security, New York, 1929. Marcus approached it slowly, almost afraid to touch it. He tried the wheel. Locked, of course. The combination was lost to time, known only to a man who'd been dead for 62 years. Marcus sat heavily on the floor, his back against the safe, and laughed. It came out half hysterical, born of exhaustion and disbelief. He'd found the penthouse. It was real. It was full of things that might be valuable. But the one thing that mattered most, the safe that probably held whatever the owner had considered truly important, was locked. He pulled out his phone. No signal up here, the concrete too thick. But he took photos anyway, documenting everything, knowing he'd need proof of this discovery. As his flashlight beam swept across the room, it caught something he'd missed initially. On the desk, partially hidden under a sheet, was a leather-bound journal. Marcus walked over and picked it up carefully. The cover bore gold-embossed initials, WJH. William James Harrington, maybe? The name on the original property deed? Marcus opened the journal. The first page, written in elegant script, read, "Private record of William J. Harrington, commenced January 1st, 1930. He turned pages carefully, scanning entries. They detailed the construction of the Grandview, investment decisions, business dealings. Then, partway through, the tone changed. An entry from December 1941, written just after Pearl Harbor. "The war will change everything. Already the government is seizing assets from anyone suspected of enemy sympathies. My collection, my fortune, everything I've built could be confiscated on the whim of paranoid bureaucrats. I'm taking precautions. The penthouse is sealed. Everything of value is locked away. When sanity returns, I'll retrieve it. If I don't survive the war, this journal will guide my heirs to the truth." Marcus turned more pages, reading faster now. Harrington detailed what he'd locked in the safe. Bonds, stock certificates, gold bars, diamonds. A personal fortune he'd assembled over 2 decades of savvy investments, and, Marcus noted with a chill, some activities that sounded distinctly illegal. An entry from 1942. The safe contains $40 million in negotiable assets. In today's terms, adjusted for inflation and appreciation, the value is incalculable. But it's more than money. It's proof. Evidence of deals made in shadows, of partnerships that could destroy powerful men. I'm sealing this record with the safe. Whoever opens it will hold the power to reshape fortunes. The journal entries ended abruptly in 1943. No explanation, just blank pages after that. Marcus sat in the darkness of the penthouse, the journal in his hands, and tried to process what he'd read. If even half of what Harrington wrote was true, if the safe contained what he claimed, then Marcus hadn't just bought a condemned building. He bought a time capsule containing a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And he had absolutely no idea how to open it. Marcus climbed back down the elevator shaft as dawn was breaking, his arms so exhausted he could barely grip the ladder rungs. By the time he emerged into the lobby, his legs were shaking and his vision was blurred with fatigue. But his mind raced, unable to slow down despite his body's desperate need for rest. He'd found something. Maybe not treasure yet, not until he opened that safe, but proof that the possibility existed. A journal written by a man who'd hidden a fortune and never retrieved it. Crates full of antiques that might be worth tens of thousands, maybe more. But he was also acutely aware of his situation. He had $2,000 to his name. The building had to be demolished in 6 months, or the city would do it and send him the bill. He had no way to open a 1929 safe without the combination. And he couldn't tell anyone about the penthouse without risking word spreading to people who might try to claim the contents. Marcus walked out of the Grandview into the early morning light and sat on the curb, the journal hidden in his backpack. Across the street, Roberto was arriving for his usual morning coffee spot, the routine of a man who'd spent 60 years in the same neighborhood. Their eyes met. Roberto crossed the street slowly and sat beside Marcus. "You found it," Roberto said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. "Everything you said. Sealed tight, untouched. And there's a safe. A big one. Locked." The old man mentioned his safe. Never said what was in it. His journal did. Marcus pulled out the leather-bound book. He claims he locked away $40 million in assets. That was $1,942. Today, with appreciation and inflation, could be worth more than you can count, Roberto finished. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I can't open the safe. Don't have the combination. Even if I did, I don't have money to properly preserve and sell whatever's up there. And in 6 months, the city's going to tear this building down with or without my permission." Roberto was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My nephew, Carlos. He's a locksmith. Been working high-security safes for 20 years. If anyone can open that old Excelsior without destroying what's inside, it's him. But he's expensive." "How expensive?" $10,000 for a job like this. Maybe more." Marcus laughed bitterly. I've got 2,000 left. Spent everything on the building. Then you need to find 8,000 fast. Roberto stood, his joints popping. Or you need to find someone willing to work on contingency. A percentage of what's found instead of upfront payment. Would your nephew do that? Roberto considered. Maybe, if he believed there was really something in that safe. Carlos is a gambler. Always has been. I could talk to him. I'd appreciate that, Marcus said quietly. More than you know. Roberto nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. The old man, Harrington, he wasn't a good person. Made his fortune doing things that would have gotten him locked up if people had known. But he loved this building, poured his heart into it. If his fortune's up there, maybe he can save the Grandview one last time, or at least let it go out with some dignity. After Roberto left, Marcus called Sarah. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry and anger. Dad, where have you been? I've been calling all night. I'm sorry, honey. No signal where I was. Where were you? Please tell me you weren't doing something dangerous. Marcus looked up at the Grandview, at the damaged upper floors where he'd spent the night climbing through condemned elevator shafts. I was doing research on the building. And Sarah, I found something. I can't explain it all yet, but this might actually work. This might save us. Dad, her voice broke. Please don't do this. Don't give me hope just to take it away again. I can't handle it. I know I've let you down, Marcus said, his own voice thick. I know you have every reason not to trust me, but I'm asking you to hold on just a little longer. Give me 2 weeks. If I can't turn this around by then, I'll come home and we'll face whatever comes together. Sarah was crying now. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I promise. She hung up without answering, and Marcus sat with the phone in his hand, hoping he hadn't just made a promise he couldn't keep. That afternoon, Roberto called. Carlos will meet you at the Grandview tonight. 9 p.m. Don't bring anyone else. And be ready to make your case, because my nephew doesn't work for free unless you can convince him it's worth his while. At 9 p.m. exactly, Marcus waited in the Grandview's lobby. His flashlight was the only source of light in the vast darkness. He heard the front door open and footsteps approach. 2 men entered, Roberto and a younger man, maybe 40, with the build of someone who worked with his hands. He carried a large case of tools and wore a headlamp that swept the lobby as he walked. Marcus Chen, Roberto said, "This is my nephew, Carlos Martinez." Carlos didn't offer to shake hands. He set down his tool case and looked around the lobby with the practiced eye of someone assessing a job. So, show me. They climbed the stairs to the second floor. Then Marcus led them to the elevator shaft. Carlos examined the shaft, the ladder, and the hatch above with his headlamp. You climbed this? He asked. Last night. It's stable enough if you're careful. Carlos grunted. Hope whatever's up there is worth it. He started climbing. The ascent took 20 minutes. By the time they reached the penthouse, even Carlos was breathing hard. Marcus led them through the broken locks into the sealed room. Carlos swept his headlamp across the space, taking in the crates, the furniture, the filing cabinets. Then his light settled on the safe. He walked toward it slowly, almost reverently. Excelsior Security. 1929 model. These were top of the line back then, built like bank vaults. He examined the dial, the wheel, the hinges. You have any idea what the combination might be? No, Marcus admitted. The owner died in 1962. Never told anyone. Then we drill. Carlos pulled off his backpack and started removing tools. But carefully, very carefully. Excelsior safes from this era have relocking mechanisms. If you trigger them, the safe becomes almost impossible to open without destroying it and everything inside. How long will it take? Marcus asked. To do it right? Maybe 3 days. I'll need to bring more equipment tomorrow, and we'll need to run power up here somehow. This isn't a job you can do with battery-powered tools. 3 days, Marcus repeated, trying not to sound desperate. And your fee? Carlos turned to look at him, his headlamp shining directly into Marcus's eyes. Uncle Roberto says you're broke. Says you spent everything you had buying this death trap. That's true. He also says you found a journal. One that suggests there's serious money in this safe. Marcus hesitated, then pulled out Harrington's journal and handed it to Carlos. Read it yourself. Carlos sat down and read by his headlamp for 10 minutes, turning pages carefully. When he looked up, his expression had changed. There was excitement there now, barely controlled. If even a quarter of what he wrote is true. We split it, Marcus said. 50-50. Whatever's in that safe, we divide it equally. You take your half, I take mine. No questions, no arguments. Carlos studied him. That's a hell of an offer if the safe's really full. And a meaningless one if it's empty. Either way, I can't afford to pay you in cash. This is the only deal I can make. Carlos looked at the safe again, then back at Marcus. He extended his hand. 50-50, but I want in writing. Legal contract, signed by both of us before I drill. They shook hands, and Marcus felt the weight of another gamble settle onto his shoulders. He'd just promised half of whatever they found to a man he'd met an hour ago. But without Carlos, the safe would remain locked forever. And locked, it was worth nothing. I'll have a contract drawn up tomorrow, Marcus said. Simple, straightforward. You open the safe, we split the contents. Fair enough. Carlos started packing up his initial tools. I'll be back tomorrow with proper equipment. In the meantime, don't tell anyone about this. Not family, not friends. The fewer people who know, the safer we all are. After they'd climbed back down and Carlos had left, Roberto pulled Marcus aside in the lobby. You trust him? Do I have a choice? No, Roberto admitted. But for what it's worth, Carlos is honest. He gambles, yeah, but he plays straight. If he agrees to split whatever you find, he'll honor it. That's all I can ask for. Roberto looked around the dark lobby one more time. I hope you find what you're looking for up there. The Grandview deserves one more moment in the sun before it comes down. That night, Marcus slept in the presidential suite instead of his car. It felt less abandoned than the other rooms, and he was too exhausted to care about the dust or the cold. He lay on the old couch, wrapped in his jacket, and thought about the safe 12 floors above him. Tomorrow Carlos would begin drilling. In 3 days, maybe less, they'd know the truth. Either Harrington had been lying or exaggerating in his journal, and the safe would contain nothing but disappointment. Or he'd been telling the truth, and Marcus's desperate gamble would pay off beyond anything he'd imagined. He thought about Sarah, studying agriculture because she believed she could help save the family farm. He thought about his ex-wife, who'd left because she couldn't watch him fail anymore. He thought about his grandfather, who'd worked the same 40 acres until his hands were too gnarled to hold the plow. Just a little longer, Marcus whispered to the darkness. Hold on just a little longer. Somewhere in the building, metal creaked as the Grandview settled for the night. It sounded almost like agreement. The next morning, Marcus met with a public defender turned contract attorney named Lisa Chong, who worked out of a cramped office above a dim sum restaurant in Chinatown. She charged $200 for simple contracts, which was $200 Marcus could barely afford, but he needed this done right. Lisa read through his handwritten draft, her expression skeptical. You're promising 50% of unknown content from a safe you don't own the combination to in a building that's condemned and scheduled for demolition. Mr. Chen, this is possibly the strangest contract I've ever been asked to draw up. Can you make it legal? Marcus asked. I can make it binding, which isn't quite the same thing. She started typing on her ancient computer. But I need to tell you, if there's anything of significant value in that safe, you're going to face challenges. Property law, estate claims, possibly tax implications. Splitting it 50-50 with your locksmith is the least of your potential problems. One problem at a time, Marcus said quietly. First, we have to get it open. Lisa worked for 2 hours, asking questions about the building purchase, the penthouse discovery, and the safe itself. By noon, she had a contract that covered the basics. Carlos Martinez would provide professional safe opening services in exchange for 50% of the contents. Both parties waived further claims against each other. The contents would be divided immediately upon opening, with each party responsible for their own half. It's not perfect, Lisa warned as she printed 2 copies. But it'll hold up if both of you sign willingly and there's no coercion. Just remember, Mr. Chen, greed makes people do stupid things. If that safe contains real money, your handshake deal might not survive first contact with reality. I'll take that chance, Marcus said, signing both copies. That afternoon, Carlos arrived with a truck full of equipment. He had a partner with him, a quiet man named David who helped carry a portable generator, professional-grade drills, and what looked like a small fiber-optic camera. "This is David," Carlos said as they hauled equipment through the lobby. "Best safe man in California. He doesn't talk much, but he knows his work. Anything we find, he gets 5% off my half. That okay with you?" Marcus had already given away 50%. What was another 5% off that? Fine with me. They spent 3 hours rigging the generator in the lobby and running power cables up the stairwell, through the corridors, and finally up the elevator shaft. By the time they reached the penthouse, it was late afternoon and all 3 men were exhausted. But Carlos came alive when he was in front of the safe. He examined it with his headlamp and tools, tapping, listening, measuring. Excelsior Security stopped making safes in 1932 after the company president was murdered in a mob hit. These safes became collector's items because they're nearly impossible to crack without the combination. The relocking mechanism is ingenious. Any attempt to force it triggers hardened steel plates that drop into place, sealing the door permanently. "So how do we open it without triggering that?" Marcus asked. Very carefully, Carlos pulled out the fiber-optic camera. "First, we look inside. These old safes have ventilation holes for air circulation. If we can thread the camera through, we might be able to see what's actually in there." He found a small hole near the top of the safe, barely wider than a pencil. Working slowly, he fed the fiber-optic cable through while David monitored a small screen connected to the camera. Marcus held his breath as the camera penetrated the safe's interior. David's expression didn't change, but he tilted the screen toward Carlos. Carlos stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Marcus. "You need to see this." Marcus moved closer. The screen showed the inside of the safe in grainy black and white. But even in low resolution, he could make out shelves loaded with items. Boxes, stacks of paper, and on the bottom shelf, bars of something that caught the light from the camera's LED. "Is that?" Marcus couldn't finish the sentence. "Gold," Carlos said quietly. "Those are gold bars. I count at least 20, maybe more." The room seemed to tilt. Marcus sat down hard on one of the crates, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "What else is in there?" he managed to ask. Carlos manipulated the camera, scanning different sections of the safe's interior. "Hard to tell exactly. Looks like document boxes, probably the stock certificates and bonds Harrington mentioned in his journal. Some wooden boxes that could be anything, and something wrapped in cloth on the top shelf, can't make out what." David spoke for the first time, his voice rough from disuse. "That's not 20 bars. That's at least 40. Each bar, if it's standard weight, is about 25 pounds. At current gold prices we're looking at." He pulled out his phone and did quick calculations. "Roughly $75 million in gold. Conservative estimate." The number hung in the air like something physical. Marcus couldn't process it. $75 million. Plus whatever the bonds and stock certificates were worth. Plus the antiques and artwork in the crates around the room. "The journal," Marcus whispered. Harrington wasn't lying. Carlos was grinning now, his professional calm cracking. "This is real. This is actually real." He turned to the safe with renewed energy. "Okay. We drill, but we take our time. No mistakes. One wrong move, and those relocking plates drop, and we'll never get in." They worked through the night. Carlos marked precise points on the safe's door, spots where he could drill without triggering the relocking mechanism. David prepared the drill bits, specialized tools designed for hardened steel. Marcus watched, feeling useless but unable to look away. Every few hours, he'd walk to the penthouse window and look out over Los Angeles at the city lights spreading to every horizon. Somewhere out, there was Sarah, worrying about him. Somewhere was the farm, dying day by day. And here, in this sealed room above a condemned building, was the answer to everything. If they could just open the safe. By dawn, Carlos had drilled 3 small holes in strategic locations around the door. Through these holes, he inserted a borescope, examining the internal locking mechanism with intense concentration. "I can see the main bolt work," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. 3-point locking system, standard for Excelsior. But there's also a time lock, probably set to delay opening even with the right combination. Clever. Very clever. Can you bypass it? Marcus asked. Maybe. The time lock mechanism is mechanical, not electronic. If I can reach it through one of these holes, I might be able to reset it manually. But it's delicate work. One slip and the whole thing locks down permanently. David handed him a tool that looked like a surgical instrument, long and thin with a hooked end. Carlos fed it through one of the drill holes, his eye pressed to the bore scope, his hands steady despite working on 3 hours of sleep. Marcus watched the concentration on Carlos's face, the absolute focus. This was a man doing what he was born to do. 20 minutes passed. 30. Then Carlos made a small sound of satisfaction. Got it. The time lock is disengaged. He withdrew the tool and sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. Now comes the hard part. I need to manipulate the bolt work manually. Usually, you'd use the combination dial, but since we don't have that, I'm going to have to force the bolts to retract without triggering the relocking plates. It's going to take a while. How long? Marcus asked. Could be 6 hours. Could be 16. No way to know until I'm in there. Carlos worked through the day, periodically stopping to rest his hands and eyes. David assisted, handing him tools, monitoring the bore scope, consulting in whispers about angles and approaches. Marcus tried to make himself useful by documenting everything with his phone camera. He photographed the crates, cataloged their contents as best he could without removing items. He counted 42 bottles of wine and champagne, some with labels he recognized as legendary vintages. He found 3 paintings that looked original, though he had no way to authenticate them. He discovered jewelry in velvet boxes, pieces that glittered even under the dim light of his phone's flashlight. Every item increased his hope and his terror in equal measure. If the safe held what they thought, he'd gone from facing financial ruin to potentially being worth over $100 million. The whiplash of it made him dizzy. By late afternoon, Carlos called him over. We're close. I've retracted 2 of the 3 main bolts. 1 more, and the door should open. Marcus's heart hammered. How long? Maybe an hour. Maybe less. Carlos picked up another tool, this one even thinner than the first. Mr. Chen, I want to say something before we open this. Whatever's in there, we split it like we agreed. 50-50, no matter what. Because once we see what we're dealing with, once it's real and not just numbers on a screen, people change. I've seen it happen. Friendships destroyed, families torn apart, all over money. So I need to hear you say it again. We're partners in this. Equal partners. Marcus met his eyes. Equal partners. I give him my word. Carlos nodded and turned back to the safe. 47 minutes later, something inside the safe clicked. It was a soft sound, barely audible, but it made all 3 men freeze. Carlos slowly withdrew his tool and placed his hands on the wheel lock. This is it. If I'm right, the wheel should turn now. He pulled. The wheel resisted for a moment, decades of disuse making it stiff. Then, with a groan of metal on metal, it began to turn. 1 full rotation. 2, 3. Then the door of the Excelsior security safe swung open. The smell hit them first. Musty paper, old metal, and something else, something expensive and forgotten. Carlos shined his headlamp inside, and all 3 men moved forward as one. The safe was exactly as the fiber optic camera had shown, but seeing in person was different. The gold bars were stacked neatly on the bottom shelf, each one stamped with Johnson Matthey and weight markings. Marcus counted them. 44 bars, each approximately 25 pounds. Above the gold, document boxes lined 2 shelves. Carlos carefully removed the first box and opened it. Inside were stock certificates, hundreds of them, all neatly organized in folders. Standard Oil. Carlos read from one certificate. Issued 1928. 1,000 shares. He pulled out another. U.S. Steel, 1930. 500 shares. Another. General Electric, 1929. 2,000 shares. Are they still valid? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. David was already on his phone, searching. Some of these companies still exist. The shares would have split multiple times over the decades, but they should still be worth something. Probably a lot of something. The next box contained bonds. Government bonds issued during the 1920s and 30s. Many had matured decades ago and never been redeemed. These might not be worth their face value anymore, David said, examining them. But to collectors, to historians, they could still be valuable. The third box made Marcus's breath catch. It was filled with jewelry. Not costume jewelry, but the real thing. Diamond necklaces, ruby bracelets, emerald rings. Pieces that belonged in museums or auction houses. "This is insane," Carlos whispered. "This is absolutely insane." But it was the top shelf that held the most shocking discovery. Carlos carefully lifted down a cloth-wrapped bundle and unfolded it on the floor. Inside were documents, letters, photographs, and what looked like ledgers. Carlos opened one of the ledgers carefully. "These are financial records," he said, scanning the pages. "But not legitimate ones. These document payoffs, bribes, illegal transactions. Look at this. Payment to Senator Morrison, $50,000 for favorable vote on California land bill. And here, contribution to Judge Blackwell's campaign, $25,000, in exchange for favorable ruling." Marcus looked over his shoulder. The ledgers documented decades of corruption, naming names that he recognized from history books. Politicians, judges, police chiefs, business leaders. All of them on Harrington's payroll, all of their dirty deals meticulously recorded. He was keeping insurance, David said quietly. Proof that if he went down, he'd take them all with him. These documents could still destroy reputations, Carlos added. Some of these families are still powerful, still influential. If this became public, Marcus thought about what Lisa Chong had said. One problem at a time. We'll worry about that later. For now, we need to secure everything and figure out what we actually have. They spent the next 4 hours carefully removing everything from the safe and cataloging it. By the time they finished, they had a preliminary inventory. 44 gold bars, approximately 1,100 pounds total, estimated value $75 million. 237 stock certificates from various companies, potential value unknown but likely significant. Federal bonds with face value of $18 million, actual current value uncertain. Jewelry estimated at $8 to $12 million. The ledgers and documents, value impossible to calculate. Plus the antiques, wine, and artwork in the crates, conservatively worth another $5 to $10 million. "We're looking at over $150 million, David said, his voice shaking slightly. "Maybe more, maybe a lot more, depending on what those stock certificates are actually worth." Carlos sat down heavily. "We need experts, appraisers, attorneys. This is way beyond anything I've ever dealt with." Marcus pulled out his phone, but there was still no signal in the penthouse. "We need to move everything to a secure location. We can't leave it here." "Agreed," Carlos said. "But we can't just walk out of here with gold bars. We need a plan." They talked through options until after midnight. Finally, they agreed on an approach. They'd move everything in stages over the next week, working at night to avoid attention. Carlos knew a secure storage facility that catered to high-value items. They'd rent a unit there and transfer everything from the penthouse. Once it was secure, they'd bring in experts to authenticate and appraise. Then they'd figure out how to liquidate without attracting the wrong kind of attention. "What about the documents?" David asked. "The ledgers with all the corruption evidence." Marcus looked at the leather-bound books, thinking about the powerful families they implicated. "We keep those separate, secure, and we decide what to do with them very carefully." By 2 a.m., they'd made their plan. They'd start tomorrow night with the gold, the most valuable and portable items. The antiques and larger pieces would come later. As they prepared to leave the penthouse, Marcus took one last look around. Less than a week ago, he'd been a failing farmer facing the loss of everything. Now he was standing in a room containing a fortune that would change his life forever. If they could get out safely. If the legal challenges didn't destroy them. If the wrong people didn't find out what they discovered. So many ifs. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. They climbed back down the elevator shaft, exhausted but wired with adrenaline. In the lobby, Carlos turned to Marcus. "Tomorrow night, 9 p.m., I'll bring a truck and moving equipment. We'll start with the gold bars. 2 or 3 trips should do it. I'll be here, Marcus said. After Carlos and David left, Marcus didn't go to his car. Instead, he climbed the stairs to the presidential suite and sat by the window, watching the city wake up as dawn approached. He needed to call Sarah, needed to tell her that everything had changed, that they were going to be okay. Better than okay. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Lisa Chang's warning about greed changing people. Maybe it was the knowledge that once he told Sarah, the secret would start to spread, and there would be no containing it. Or maybe he just wanted to hold on to this moment a little longer. This space between destitution and wealth, between failure and success. Once he crossed that threshold, everything would change. Who he was, how people saw him, what they expected from him. For now, he was still just Marcus Chen, a farmer who'd made a desperate gamble. Tomorrow, he'd be something else entirely. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, "Dad, please call me. I'm worried." Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, "I'm okay. I promise. I'll call you tonight. I love you." He hit send before he could overthink it. That day passed in a blur. Marcus tried to rest, but couldn't sleep. His mind raced with logistics, with calculations, with fantasies of what he'd do with the money. Save the farm, obviously. Pay off every debt. Set up a trust for Sarah so she'd never have to worry about money again. But beyond that, he'd never thought about being wealthy. It felt abstract, like planning for life on another planet. By 8 p.m., he was back at the Grandview, nervous energy making his hands shake. Carlos arrived at 9 p.m. exactly, driving a plain white moving truck with David in the passenger seat. "Ready?" Carlos asked. "Ready." They worked quickly and quietly, hauling the gold bars down from the penthouse 4 at a time in reinforced bags. Each trip took nearly 30 minutes, the climb down the elevator shaft made harder by the weight. By 2 a.m., they'd moved all 44 bars to the truck. Carlos locked them in the back and turned to Marcus. "This is real now. We just loaded $75 million in gold into a truck. Tomorrow morning, we deposit it in the secure storage. After that, we start the authentication process. And then," Marcus asked, "and then we change our lives," Carlos said simply. They made 3 more trips over the following week, moving the stock certificates, bonds, jewelry, and finally the antiques and artwork. Each night, Marcus half expected police to arrive, or thieves, or some other disaster. But the Grandview kept its secrets, and they worked unmolested. On the 8th day, after opening the safe, everything was secured in a climate-controlled storage unit registered under a holding company Lisa Chang had helped them set up. The unit had 24-hour security, insurance for up to $200 million, and required both Marcus's and Carlos's authorization to access. Now came the hard part, turning their discovery into actual money. Lisa Chang recommended they start with the gold. It was the easiest to liquidate and would provide immediate capital. She connected them with a precious metals dealer named Harold Greenberg, who'd been in the business for 40 years and had a reputation for discretion. Greenberg met them at the storage facility, a small man in his 70s with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. When they showed him the gold bars, his expression didn't change, but his hands trembled slightly as he examined the first one. "Johnson Matthey, 1920s vintage. These are beautiful pieces." He weighed one, tested it, examined the stamp. "Where did you get these?" "Legally acquired from an estate," Lisa said smoothly. She coached them on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. Greenberg looked skeptical but didn't push. "The gold itself is worth spot price, currently about $65 million for the entire lot. But these bars are also collectible. The vintage, the maker, the condition. To the right buyers, you might get a 20% premium." $78 million, Marcus said quietly. "Approximately. But it'll take time to sell them all without flooding the market. I can move 5 or 6 bars a month through my network. More than that, and you'll drive the price down." "How long to sell everything?" Carlos asked. 8 months. Maybe 10. And I'll need a 15% commission." Marcus and Carlos looked at each other. 15% of $78 million was over $11 million. But they needed someone they could trust, and Greenberg came highly recommended. Deal, Marcus said, but we won the first 5 bars sold within 2 weeks. Greenberg nodded. I can do that. 5 bars at spot price plus premium. Minus my commission, you're looking at about $7 million. $7 million. In 2 weeks. Marcus's share would be $3.5 million. He thought about the farm, dying under the drought. About Sarah's tuition. About every sleepless night he'd spent wondering how he'd keep the lights on. $3.5 million would solve every problem he'd ever had. And it was just the beginning. Over the next month, they methodically worked through their discovery with experts. A stockbroker analyzed the certificates and delivered shocking news. After accounting for splits and company mergers, the 237 certificates were worth approximately $47 million. The bonds were less valuable than their face value, but still significant. A bond specialist estimated they could be sold to collectors for about $4 million total. The jewelry went to an auction house, which valued it at $11 million and agreed to sell on consignment. The artwork and antiques were harder to assess. 2 of the paintings were attributed to minor impressionist artists and valued at $2 million each. The wine collection, incredibly, was worth nearly $3 million to collectors, with some bottles considered among the finest surviving examples of their vintages. By the time all the appraisals were complete, their discovery was valued at $152 million. Split 50-50 between Marcus and Carlos. They'd each walk away with $76 million. The number was so absurd that Marcus couldn't process it. He'd gone from broke to wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined. His daughter's future was secure. The farm was saved. He could retire, buy a new house, travel, do anything he wanted. But first, he needed to tell Sarah. He drove back to Kern County for the first time in 6 weeks. The farm looked worse than when he'd left. The almond trees were completely dead now, just twisted skeletons reaching toward an indifferent sky. The house needed paint. Weeds had taken over the yard. Sarah's car was parked out front. She'd come home from college for the weekend, probably to check on the place, maybe to start packing up their belongings for the inevitable foreclosure. Marcus found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a stack of bills and a calculator. She looked up when he entered, and her expression cycled through relief, anger, and exhaustion. Dad. Hi, honey. 6 weeks. You've been gone 6 weeks. I had to drop out of school because I couldn't focus. The bank called 17 times. The county sent a final notice on the property taxes. And you just disappeared. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry. Sarah stood, her hands shaking. That's it? That's all you have to say? Dad, I thought you were dead. I thought you'd done something stupid and gotten yourself killed, and I'd have to identify your body and figure out how to bury you when we can't even afford groceries. Marcus walked to her and pulled her into a hug. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, sobbing. I'm sorry, he said again. I'm so sorry I scared you. But Sarah, I need you to listen to me. Everything's okay now. Better than okay. She pulled back, wiping her eyes. What are you talking about? The building I bought. The condemned hotel. I found something inside. Something valuable. Sarah stared at him. How valuable? Very. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the photos he'd taken in the penthouse. The safe. The gold bars. The stock certificates. After we sell everything, my share will be about $76 million. Sarah looked at the photos, then at him, then back at the photos. This is a joke. You're joking. I'm not joking. It's real. All of it. We're going to be okay. Sarah, we're going to be more than okay. She sat down heavily, staring at nothing. $76 million. Give or take. That's not real. That can't be real. Marcus sat beside her and told her everything. The auction, Roberto's tip about the penthouse, finding the safe, Carlos opening it. The gold, the stocks, the bonds. All of it. When he finished, Sarah was crying again, but differently this time. We're really going to be okay. We're really going to be okay. She hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. I was so scared, Dad. I was so scared we'd lose everything. I know. Me too. But we didn't. We won. They sat together in the kitchen of their dying farm, holding each other while the reality of their new life slowly sank in. Finally, Sarah pulled back and wiped her eyes. What happens now? Now, Marcus said, we decide what kind of life we want to build. The next weeks were a whirlwind. Marcus hired an accountant, a financial advisor, and a team of attorneys to handle the complex legal issues surrounding the discovery. The city of Los Angeles initially tried to claim the penthouse contents as abandoned property, but Lisa Chong fought them successfully, arguing that everything had been sealed in a private residence and thus remained private property even after foreclosure. Harrington's distant relatives emerged, claiming they had rights to the estate. But since Harrington had died intestate and his estate had been settled in 1963, their claims went nowhere. The first gold bar sold, and Marcus's bank account swelled by $3.5 million. He paid off the farm's debts, all the back taxes, the mortgage on the house. He paid Patricia back for her $500 loan, plus $50,000 as a thank you. He set up a trust fund for Sarah that would pay for college, graduate school, and whatever came after. And he kept the farm. Not to work it, not anymore, but because it was his grandfather's, his father's, his. Some things mattered beyond their monetary value. Carlos, meanwhile, bought a house in Santa Monica and started a high-end security consulting business. David opened his own safe and locksmith shop. Roberto retired with a generous gift from both Marcus and Carlos, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But the ledgers, those leather-bound books documenting decades of corruption, remained locked in the storage unit. Marcus couldn't decide what to do with them. They named names, some of whom were still alive, others whose children and grandchildren held positions of power. Releasing them would destroy reputations and careers, possibly send people to prison for crimes committed decades ago. But keeping them secret felt like a betrayal of truth. 3 months after opening the safe, Marcus sat in his newly renovated farmhouse with Sarah, discussing the problem. The people who did these things should be held accountable, Sarah said, even if it was a long time ago. Some of them are dead. Their grandchildren would pay for their crimes. That's how corruption works, though. It's generational. The money and power get passed down along with the dirty secrets. Marcus thought about this. What if we release them to a historian? Someone who can put them in context, use them for research, maybe write a book? The truth gets out, but in a way that serves education rather than revenge. Sarah considered this. I like that. Let the history speak for itself. They donated the ledgers to a university archives, with the stipulation that they be made available to researchers but not sensationalized. The donation made headlines. Corruption ledgers from 1920s. 40s reveal widespread bribery, read the New York Times. Historians called it one of the most significant discoveries of primary source document from that era. Several families sued to suppress publication, but the courts ruled in favor of historical transparency. Books were written, doctoral theses researched. The legacy of that corruption was finally examined in the light of day. And Marcus Chen, the farmer who'd bought a condemned building on a desperate gamble, became known as the man who'd exposed a hidden chapter of American history. But that wasn't the end of the story, because 6 months after opening the safe, Marcus received a phone call from a woman named Margaret Harrington Blackwell. Mr. Chen, I believe you found my grandfather's safe. Marcus's blood ran cold. Who is this? I'm William Harrington's granddaughter. I've been searching for that safe for 40 years. It's been authenticated legally. The contents are mine. I'm not calling to claim the money, Mr. Chen. I'm calling to thank you. That surprised him. Thank me? My grandfather was a monster. The ledgers you donated to the university, they proved what my family always suspected but could never confirm. He built his fortune on corruption and cruelty. Releasing those documents was the right thing to do, even though it damaged my family's reputation. Then why are you calling? Because there's something else in that safe. Something the appraisers might have missed. My grandfather had a second ledger, one he kept separate from his corruption records. It documented his legitimate business dealings, his investments that were actually legal. My grandmother told me about it before she died. She said if anyone ever found the safe, they should know that not everything he did was criminal. He also built real businesses, employed people, contributed to the city. I didn't find a second ledger, Marcus said. It was hidden, false bottom in the safe. If you still have access, you might want to look again. Marcus was back in the storage unit that afternoon with Carlos. They examined the massive Excelsior safe, now empty of its original contents. False bottom, Carlos muttered, tapping along the interior. These old safes sometimes had them, but I didn't think to check. He worked for 20 minutes before finding the release mechanism. A section of the safe's floor lifted up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was another ledger and a letter. Marcus opened the letter carefully. It was addressed to whoever opens this safe. The handwriting was shaky, the work of an old man. The letter was dated 1961, a year before Harrington died. If you're reading this, it began, "You found my safe and discover my secrets. The main ledgers document my crimes. I don't apologize for them. I did what I had to do to survive and thrive in a corrupt system. But I want you to know I wasn't only a criminal. This second ledger documents my legitimate business. I owned apartment buildings that provided affordable housing. I funded scholarships for poor children. I donated to hospitals and libraries. I did some good in the world, even while doing evil. The money in this safe was meant for my family, but if they haven't found it by now, they probably never will. So I'm leaving a message for whoever does find it. Use this fortune better than I did. Build something that lasts, something that helps people. Don't just hoard it or spend it on luxuries. Make it mean something. And if you can, tell the truth about me. All of it. The crimes and the charity. The corruption and the kindness. People are never just one thing. I was a villain and a benefactor. I hurt people and I help people. Let history judge the whole man, not just the worst parts." William J. Harrington, December 1961. Marcus finished reading and handed the letter to Carlos, who read it in silence. "Well," Carlos said finally. "That's unexpected. He wanted the truth told," Marcus said. "He wanted the money to do good. Maybe we should listen to him." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He thought about Harrington's letter, about the request to make the fortune mean something. He'd already set up trusts for Sarah, paid off debts, secured his future. But he had tens of millions left. What was he supposed to do with it? The next morning, he called a meeting with Sarah, Carlos, and Lisa Chong. "I want to start a foundation," he announced. "Use part of the money to help other people in situations like mine. Farmers facing foreclosure. Small business owners drowning in debt. Single parents who need a break." Sarah's face lit up. "Dad, that's perfect. I was thinking," Marcus continued, "maybe we could save the Grandview too. Not demolish it. Restore it. Turn it into affordable housing or a community center. Honor what it was, give a new purpose." Carlos nodded slowly. "The structural damage from the earthquake is extensive, but not impossible to fix. Expensive, but not impossible." "How expensive?" Marcus asked. 10 million, maybe 15 to do it right. Marcus had 15 million to spare. "Let's do it." Over the next year, the Grandview Hotel was reborn. Structural engineers stabilized the damaged floors. Architect preserved the Art Deco details while modernizing the interior. The ballroom was restored to its 1929 glory. The lobby's marble floors were cleaned and repaired. But instead of luxury hotel rooms, the upper floors became affordable apartments for working families. 60 units total, renting at below-market rates to people who needed a break, a chance to get ahead. The ground floor housed the Harrington Chen Foundation, named for both the man who'd hidden the fortune and the man who'd found it. The foundation provided grants to farmers, small business owners, and families facing financial crisis. And in the Penthouse, the space that had held secrets for 60 years, Marcus created a museum. The Grandview Heritage Museum told the story of the hotel, its rise and fall, the safe and its contents, and the complicated man who'd built it all. Visitors could see a replica of the safe, read excerpts from both ledgers, and learn about Los Angeles history through the lens of one building's century-long story. On opening day, Marcus stood in the restored lobby with Sarah, Carlos, Roberto, and Margaret Blackwell. The chandeliers sparkled, the marble gleamed, and people streamed through the doors to see what had been saved from demolition. "Your grandfather would have hated this," Marcus said to Margaret. She smiled. "Probably. but he'd also recognized the audacity of it, building something meaningful from ruins. That's what he did, in his own twisted way. You're just doing it better. Roberto was crying, not bothering to hide it. 32 years I worked here. Never thought I'd see her beautiful again. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand. You did it, Dad. You saved the farm, you saved this building, and you're helping people who need it. I'm so proud of you. Marcus looked around the lobby, at the people exploring the museum, at the families moving into affordable housing upstairs, at the foundation staff helping applicants in their ground floor offices. He thought about the desperate farmer who'd bid on a condemned building with his last $60,000, driven by nothing but hope and fear. That man had been terrified he'd made the worst mistake of his life. He'd actually made the best decision he'd ever make. Because sometimes, when you've got nothing left to lose, the craziest gamble becomes the smartest play. Sometimes, the buildings everyone else abandons are the ones hiding the greatest treasures. And sometimes, a safe lock for 60 years is just waiting for the right person to open it and let the truth finally come home. The Grandview's grand reopening made national news. Condemned hotel becomes symbol of second chances, read the CNN headline. The story resonated beyond Los Angeles, beyond California. People wrote letters to Marcus from across the country, sharing their own struggles with debt, foreclosure, and desperation. The foundation was flooded with applications. Single mothers asking for help with rent, farmers facing drought and bankruptcy, small business owners who bet everything and lost. Each story reminded Marcus of his own terror, that feeling of watching everything you've built crumble while the world looks away. He couldn't help them all. The foundation's endowment, generous as it was, had limits. But they helped hundreds in the first year. Grants to pay off crushing debts. Low-interest loans to save family farms. Emergency funds for medical bills and education costs. Sarah left agricultural science and switched to nonprofit management. I can help more farmers this way, she told Marcus. Not just ours, but thousands of them. She became the foundation's program director, reviewing applications, meeting with families, deciding who received help. She was good at it, combining compassion with practical business sense. Marcus watched his daughter transform from a worried college student to a confident young woman who knew her purpose. That alone would have made the Grandview discovery worth it. But 6 months after the reopening, a complication arose. Marcus received a certified letter from a law firm in New York. Inside was a claim against the Harrington estate from an organization called the Society for Historical Preservation. They argued that items of significant historical value, specifically the documents and ledgers, should be considered cultural artifacts subject to special regulations. They're trying to claim the ledgers should have been turned over to the government rather than donated to a university, Lisa Chong explained over the phone. It's a weak argument, but they have backing from some powerful people who don't want those corruption records available to researchers. The ledgers are already public, Marcus said. The university has them. They're asking for them to be returned and sealed for another 50 years, claiming national security concerns. Marcus felt the old anger rising. National security? It's corruption from 80 years ago. I know, but some of the families implicated are still influential. They're pulling strings, applying pressure. This is going to be a fight. The lawsuit dragged on for 8 months. Depositions, motions, hearings. The other side had unlimited resources and political connections. They filed motion after motion, trying to bury the case in paperwork and legal fees. But Marcus had learned something in his journey from desperate farmer to foundation director. Money could buy lawyers, but it couldn't buy truth. And the truth, once exposed to daylight, was hard to bury again. The university refused to return the ledgers. Historians testified about their importance. Journalists wrote articles about attempts to suppress historical records. Public opinion turned against the families trying to hide their ancestors' crimes. Finally, a federal judge ruled decisively. These documents are historical records of public corruption. The public has a right to access them. Motion denied. The victory felt good, but had cost Marcus something. He'd spent months dealing with lawyers instead of helping people. The foundation's work had slowed. and he'd made enemies among the powerful families who'd wanted the ledgers sealed. "Welcome to the consequences of doing the right thing," Carlos said when Marcus complained about it over dinner. "You expose corruption. Corruption fights back. It's the price of not walking away when you could have." Carlos had his own complications. His security consulting business was thriving, but some of his former locksmith contacts had grown resentful of his sudden wealth. Rumors spread that he'd stolen the Grandview fortune, that he'd manipulated Marcus, that the whole story was a scam. "People can't accept that sometimes things just work out," Carlos said bitterly. "They need there to be a catch, a crime, something wrong. The idea that we just got lucky finding that safe? They can't handle it." But the complications weren't all external. One evening, Marcus received a call from David, Carlos's partner who'd helped open the safe. His voice was strained, careful. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about something. In person, not over the phone." They met at a coffee shop in Santa Monica. David looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. David pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a photograph. It was from inside the Grandview penthouse, showing the open safe and its contents. But the angle was wrong. This photo hadn't been taken by Marcus or Carlos. Where did this come from? Marcus's stomach tightened. "Someone sent it to me. No message, just the photo." Then another came. David swiped to a second image. This one showed Marcus, Carlos, and David loading gold bars into the truck. "We're being watched," David said quietly. "Someone documented everything. And now they're reaching out." "Reaching out how?" David showed him a text message. "I know what you found. I know what you're hiding. We need to talk about the second safe." Marcus's blood ran cold. "Second safe? There's no second safe." "That's what I thought. But look at this." David pulled out a folded document. It was a blueprint of the Grandview, dated 1929. And in the penthouse, it showed two safes. One where they'd found the Excelsior, and another, smaller one, behind the wall in what had been the bathroom. "We searched that penthouse thoroughly," Marcus said. "There's no second safe. The bathroom was destroyed in the earthquake. The entire wall collapsed. If there was a safe behind it, it would have been exposed or fallen to the floor below." Marcus thought back to the penthouse. The bathroom had indeed been damaged, the fixtures destroyed, one wall partially collapsed. They'd avoided it because it was structurally unstable. "We need to check," David said, "because whoever sent me this, they know something, and they're going to want something in return for their silence." That night, Marcus, Carlos, and David returned to the Grandview. The building was occupied now, families living in the apartments, foundation staff working in the offices. But the penthouse was still empty, preserved as part of the museum, accessible only with special permission. They climbed the stairs instead of the old elevator shaft route. The penthouse had been stabilized structurally, but it remained largely unchanged from when they'd first discovered it. The bathroom was still a ruin. Cracked tiles, a broken toilet, the sink torn from the wall. And one wall, the exterior wall, with a section that had partially collapsed during the earthquake. Carlos examined the damaged wall carefully with his flashlight. "There's something behind here. The wall's thicker than it should be." They carefully removed loose bricks and plaster. Behind them, embedded in the reinforced concrete, was indeed a small safe. Much smaller than the Excelsior, maybe 2 feet square. And unlike the main safe, this one's door had been torn open by the earthquake, its locking mechanism destroyed by the force of the building's collapse. Marcus reached inside. His fingers touched metal. He pulled out a heavy box, about the size of a cigar box, made of steel and somehow still sealed despite the safe's damaged door. "What is it?" David whispered. Marcus found the latch and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were diamonds. Dozens of them, loose stones of various sizes, sparkling even in the dim flashlight beam. And underneath the diamonds, a letter. Marcus unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear. Harrington's handwriting. "If you found the main safe," the letter read, "you found my fortune and my confession. But this safe contains something different. Insurance against my insurance. These diamonds are untraceable, purchased with cash from dealers who kept no records. They're worth at least $20 million, probably more. They're my escape fund, in case everything else falls apart. But they're also leverage, because the people documented in my ledgers, the politicians and judges and police chiefs I bribed, many of them were just as corrupt as me. If they ever tried to destroy me using my own records against me, I could destroy them right back. These diamonds funded a separate investigation run by private detectives documenting their crimes independent of my involvement. That documentation is hidden elsewhere. The details of where are in a safe deposit box at First National Bank, Box 2847, under the name James Morrison. The key is underneath the false bottom of this box. Whoever finds this, you now have leverage over some very powerful families. Use it wisely, or don't use it at all. But know that truth is the only currency that never loses value. WJH. Marcus felt for the bottom of the steel box. It lifted out, revealing a small brass key. The three men sat in the ruined bathroom, staring at the diamonds and the key. "This is bigger than we thought," Carlos said quietly. Harrington wasn't just documenting corruption. He was running a counterintelligence operation. "Do we go to the bank?" David asked. "See what's in that safe deposit box." Marcus thought about the lawsuit they just won, about the powerful families who try to seal the ledgers. What would they do if they knew there was more evidence, more documentation of their ancestors' crimes? "Yes," he said finally, "but carefully, and we document everything before we open anything. I'm not getting caught in another legal nightmare because we weren't thorough." The next morning, Marcus and Lisa Chong went to First National Bank. The building was old, downtown Los Angeles, the kind of place that had weathered decades without changing much. The bank manager was skeptical when Marcus explained he had a key to a safe deposit box registered to a James Morrison in 1942. That account would have been closed decades ago due to inactivity, the manager said. "Can you check anyway?" Lisa asked, using her lawyer voice. The manager disappeared into a back office. 20 minutes later, he returned looking puzzled. "The box still exists. Box 2847, registered to James Morrison, with annual fees paid through an automatic trust disbursement. The trust was set up to pay in perpetuity, which is why the box was never closed." "Can we access it?" Marcus asked, holding up the key. The manager hesitated. "This is highly irregular. We'll need documentation proving you have legal authority." It took 3 days of paperwork and legal wrangling. Lisa provided documents showing Marcus's ownership of the Grandview and everything found within it. She argued that the safe deposit box, paid for through Harrington's trust and referenced in Harrington's letter, was effectively part of the Grandview estate. Finally, the bank relented. Marcus was escorted to the vault, an underground chamber that smelled of old metal and stale air. Box 2847 was in the back corner, covered in dust. The key fit perfectly. Inside the long metal box were folders. Dozens of them, each labeled with a name. Marcus recognized some of the names from Harrington's corruption ledgers. But these folders contained different evidence. Photographs of politicians accepting bribes from people other than Harrington. Financial records showing embezzlement and fraud. Sworn statements from witnesses. Private investigators' reports detailing affairs, business fraud, and criminal conspiracies. Harrington had been telling the truth. He'd documented his own corruption, but he'd also documented everyone else's. Mutual assured destruction, 1940 style. Lisa reviewed the files carefully. "This is explosive. Some of these families are still prominent. Senators, judges, business leaders. Their grandparents committed crimes, and some of them built their fortunes on those crimes. What do we do with it?" Marcus asked. "The same thing you did with the ledgers. Donate them to the university archives. Let historians sort through it. The truth deserves to be told, even if it's ugly." But this time, before they donated anything, Lisa insisted they make multiple copies and store them in different locations. If these families try to suppress the ledgers, they'll definitely try to suppress this. "We need insurance for our insurance." They spent a week scanning every document, creating digital backups, storing copies with 3 different attorneys in 3 different states. Only then did they donate the originals to the university. The headlines were even bigger this time. New documents reveal widespread corruption in 1930s 40s Los Angeles. Major newspapers dedicated entire sections to the revelations. Historians called it the most comprehensive documentation of political corruption ever discovered. And just as Lisa predicted, the lawsuits started immediately. 5 different families filed injunctions trying to prevent publication. They claimed privacy rights, defamation, emotional distress. One lawsuit claimed that since Harrington had obtained the information through illegal means, private investigators potentially breaking laws, the evidence was inadmissible and should be destroyed. But this time, Marcus was ready. The evidence was already public, already distributed. You can't put that genie back in a bottle. The lawsuits dragged on, but they were destined to fail. The truth was out. Books were being written. Dissertations researched. The full scope of Los Angeles corruption in the pre-war era was finally being examined. And Marcus received death threats. They started as angry letters, then escalated to phone calls. Someone threw a brick through the foundation's window. Marcus's car was vandalized. Sarah received threatening emails. The police took it seriously, but there was little they could do. The threats were vague enough to avoid criminal charges. Probably relatives of the implicated families, angry that their ancestors' reputations were being destroyed. Carlos hired security for the foundation and for Marcus personally. You exposed powerful people. Some of them are going to lash out. This is the price. Marcus had known there would be consequences, but he hadn't fully understood what they'd feel like. The constant looking over his shoulder. The fear every time Sarah left the house. The knowledge that doing the right thing had made him a target. One night, exhausted and scared, he almost regretted finding the safe at all. But then he received a letter that changed his perspective. It came from a woman named Elena Vasquez, 78 years old, living in a nursing home in San Diego. Her handwriting was shaky but determined. Dear Mr. Chen, it began. I saw the news about the documents you found. One of them mentions my father, Roberto Vasquez. He was a city building inspector in 1938. Your documents show he was taking bribes from developers to approve unsafe buildings. I always wondered how he afforded our house, how he paid for my sisters and me to go to college. He said he'd invested well, been lucky. But I knew something was wrong. The guilt ate at him. He drank himself to death when I was 20. For 60 years, I've lived with the shame of not knowing the truth. Your documents gave me that truth. Yes, my father was corrupt. Yes, he did wrong. But now I know, and knowing is better than wondering. Thank you for having the courage to let the truth out. It hurts, but it heals too. You gave me closure I've been seeking my whole life. Gratefully, Elena Vasquez. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision. He'd been so focused on the anger, the threats, the lawsuits. He'd forgotten that truth, even painful truth, could be a gift to those seeking it. He showed the letter to Sarah that evening. This is why you did it, she said quietly. Not for the money, not for the fame, for people like Elena who needed to know. Marcus nodded. I just wish it didn't come with so much cost. Nothing worthwhile ever does, Sarah said. But Dad, look at what you've built. The foundation has helped 300 families in the past year. The Grandview is home to 60 families who couldn't afford housing anywhere else. You exposed corruption that needed exposing. You did everything right. Then why does it feel so hard? Sarah hugged him. Because you care. If it was easy, if you didn't feel the weight of it, you wouldn't be the person you are. The threats eventually subsided. The lawsuits were dismissed one by one. The families who tried to suppress the truth were themselves exposed, their attempts at censorship becoming part of the story. And slowly, Marcus adjusted to his new reality. He was no longer the anonymous farmer from Kern County. He was Marcus Chen, the man who'd found the Grandview fortune, the philanthropist, the foundation director, the accidental historian who'd exposed decades of hidden corruption. People recognized him on the street. Journalists requested interviews. Universities invited him to speak. It was overwhelming and exhausting and nothing like the quiet life he'd imagined. But it was also meaningful in ways he hadn't expected. 1 year after finding the second safe, Marcus stood in the Grandview Heritage Museum watching visitors examine the exhibits. A school group clustered around the replica of the Excelsior safe, their teacher explaining how it had remained locked for 60 years. A young girl, maybe 10, raised her hand. How did they know to look for the safe? How did they know it was there? The teacher smiled. They didn't. Mr. Chen bought this building hoping to fix it up and sell it. He had no idea what he'd find. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from taking chances on things everyone else has given up on. The girl considered this. So he just got lucky. Partly, the teacher said, but he also had the courage to explore when everyone else said the building was worthless. Luck favors the brave. Marcus smiled at that. Luck favors the brave. He liked it. He walked upstairs to the foundation offices. Sarah was reviewing grant applications, her desk covered in files representing families in crisis. How many this week? Marcus asked. 47 applications. We can fund maybe 12. That's 12 families who won't lose everything. Sarah nodded. I got one from a farmer in Nebraska. Drought killed his wheat crop. Banks foreclosing on land his family has owned for 4 generations. His story sounds exactly like yours. Marcus sat down and read the application. Robert Sullivan, 49 years old, married with 3 kids. Everything in his story echoed Marcus's own desperation from 2 years ago. Fund him, Marcus said. Full amount. Save his farm. Dad, that's $180,000. It'll eat up most of this month's budget. I know, but I remember what it feels like. That terror. That shame. If we can save him from that, it's worth it. Sarah made the note in her file. You know we can't save everyone, right? There are thousands of families in situations like his. But sitting here now, watching his new trees grow, knowing that hundreds of families have been saved from the same desperation he'd faced, Marcus wouldn't change a thing. Well, maybe one thing. He pulled out his phone and called his ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since she'd left. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice wary. Marcus. Hi, Jennifer. I know it's been a while. I heard about what happened. The building, the money. Everyone's heard. Yeah, it's been quite a ride. Marcus took a breath. I called to say I'm sorry. For not being a better partner. For letting the farm consume everything. For making you feel like you had to choose between staying and surviving. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, thank you for saying that. I was so focused on not losing the farm that I lost you instead. That was stupid. We were both young. Both stubborn. I could have handled it better too. They talked for an hour, the longest conversation they'd had in 5 years. By the end, they weren't getting back together. Too much time had passed, too much had changed. But they found something better than romance. They found forgiveness. I'm glad things worked out for you, Jennifer said before hanging up. You deserved a break. You always worked so hard. We both did. That's the thing about farming. The work is never enough on its own. Sometimes you need luck too. Well, you definitely got that. After they said goodbye, Marcus sat in the darkness, feeling lighter than he had in years. The farm wasn't the only thing he'd nearly lost. He'd nearly lost himself too, in the grinding poverty and constant fear. The Grandview fortune hadn't just saved his finances. It had saved him. 3 months later, the foundation went national. They opened offices in 5 states, focusing on agricultural communities hit by drought, climate change, and economic collapse. In the first year, they helped over 1,000 families. Sarah became the national program director at 22 years old. She was brilliant at it, understanding both the business side and the human side, knowing when to be tough and when to be compassionate. Carlos joined as director of operations, bringing his organizational skills and work ethic. Between the 3 of them, they built something bigger than any of them had imagined. The Grandview Hotel, meanwhile, became a Los Angeles landmark. The museum attracted thousands of visitors annually. The affordable housing filled with families who worked hard but couldn't afford market-rate rent. The foundation offices hummed with activity. I know, but we save the ones we can, and maybe they'll pay it forward someday. Help someone else who's drowning. That evening, Marcus drove out to his farm in Kern County. He hadn't sold it, despite selling almost everything else. The dead almond orchard had been cleared away, and he'd planted new trees, a different variety, more drought-resistant. They wouldn't produce almonds for 5 more years. Marcus would be 52 by then, and he didn't need the income anymore. But he planted them anyway, because some things weren't about profit. Some things were about continuity, about maintaining connection to the land and the generations who'd worked it before. He walked through the young orchard as the sun set, touching the small trees, imagining the day they'd bear fruit. His grandfather had planted the original orchard in 1952. His father had tended it for 40 years. Marcus had nearly lost it through drought and desperation. But now it would continue. Different trees, different future, but the same land. The same dream of making something grow in difficult soil. His phone rang. "Carlos, you sitting down?" Carlos asked. "Should I be?" "Greenberg just sold the last of the gold bars. All 44 are gone. Your final share comes to $37.8 million. Marcus had gotten so used to having money that the number barely registered. "That's good." "Good." Carlos laughed. "Man, 2 years ago you would have killed for $37,000. Now you hear $37 million and say that's good? I guess I've changed. We both have. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. The foundation, you ever think about expanding it? Going national instead of just California?" Marcus considered this. "You offering to help?" "Maybe. My security business is doing fine, but it's not particularly meaningful. I've been thinking I want to do something that matters. The foundation matters." "Come on board," Marcus said. "We'll figure out the details, but yes. Let's go bigger. Help more people." After hanging up, Marcus sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching night fall over the farm. 2 years ago, he'd been here, facing eviction, preparing to lose everything. He'd driven to Los Angeles on a desperate gamble, spent his last money on a condemned building, and changed his life forever. It hadn't been easy. There'd been threats, lawsuits, complications he never anticipated. The money brought its own problems, its own weight. And in the penthouse, preserved exactly as they'd found it, visitors could see where it all began. The safe stood open, empty now, but still impressive. Photographs showed the gold bars, the stock certificates, the jewels. Harrington's letters were displayed under glass. One exhibit explained the whole story. How a desperate farmer had bought a condemned building. How an old maintenance worker had shared a secret. How a safe locked for 60 years had finally opened. And how $152 million in hidden treasure had transformed from a personal fortune into a force for good. Marcus gave tours sometimes when he was at the Grandview. He liked talking to visitors, especially young people who were struggling with their own challenges. The thing about treasure, he'd tell them, is that finding it is only the beginning. What matters is what you do with it afterward. I could have hoarded this money, lived in luxury, never worked another day in my life. And for about a week, I seriously considered it. "What changed your mind?" someone would invariably ask. I remembered what it felt like to be desperate, to have no options, to watch everything you've built crumble. And I realized that if I could spare even one person from feeling that way, the money was better spent helping them than buying another luxury I didn't need. He gestured around the restored Grandview. This building was condemned. Everyone said it should be demolished. But someone built it with love and ambition 90 years ago. It seemed wrong to just erase it. So he saved it and gave it new purpose. Just like the money saved my farm and gave me new purpose. "Do you ever regret finding the safe?" a teenager asked once. "All the lawsuits and threats and complications?" Marcus considered this. Sometimes, when the threats got scary, when the lawsuits dragged on, yeah, I wondered if my life would be simpler if I'd never climbed up that elevator shaft. But simpler isn't always better. I have purpose now. I'm helping people. I'm part of something bigger than myself. That's worth the complications. 5 years after buying the Grandview, Marcus was invited to speak at a national conference on philanthropy. The keynote address to 2,000 nonprofit leaders and foundation directors. He stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and felt the absurdity of it all. 5 years ago, he'd been sleeping in his car outside a condemned building. Now, he was a keynote speaker at a national conference. "I'm not a philanthropist," he began. "Not really. I didn't earn this money through years of hard work or brilliant business decisions. I got lucky. Ridiculously, impossibly lucky. I bought a building for $60,000 and found $152 million inside it. Laughter rippled through the audience. But here's what I learned about luck, Marcus continued. It's not enough. Finding the money was lucky. What I did with it afterward, that was a choice. And every day since then has been a series of choices. To help people or hoard wealth. To expose truth or protect powerful families. To build something meaningful or just coast on good fortune. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I grew up on a farm. And farming teaches you something important. You can have the best soil, the perfect weather, all the right conditions. But if you don't plant seeds and do the work, nothing grows. Luck gives you opportunities. What you do with those opportunities, that's character. The speech was well received. Afterward, dozens of people approached him with questions, requests for advice, pitches for partnerships. But the person who meant the most was waiting at the back of the crowd. An elderly woman in her 80s, using a walker, patient while everyone else got their time with Marcus. Finally, she reached him. Mr. Chen, I'm Ruth Morrison. The name triggered recognition. Morrison? As in James Morrison, the fake name Harrington used. She smiled. My late husband, William Harrington, was my father. Marcus's breath caught. You're Harrington's daughter? I am. And I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. My father was a complicated man. Brilliant and cruel, generous and corrupt. I spent my whole life trying to understand him, to reconcile the man who taught me to read with the man who destroyed careers for profit. I'm sorry the ledgers hurt your family's reputation, Marcus said carefully. Don't be. The truth needed to come out. My children, my grandchildren, they deserve to know who their ancestor really was. All of him, not just the sanitized version. She reached in her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is for you. A letter my father wrote me before he died. I think you should have it. Marcus opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter dated December 1962 in Harrington's handwriting. My dear Ruth, it began. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've lived 87 years, built an empire, accumulated a fortune, and made more enemies than friends. But my greatest regret is that I didn't do more good with the power I had. The fortune in my safe is insurance, meant to protect me from my own crimes. But if it's never found, if I die without using it, then I hope whoever discovers it does what I could not. Uses it to help people instead of hurt them. Builds instead of destroys. If that person is you, my daughter, you'll know what to do. You've always had a better heart than mine. If it's a stranger, I hope they're worthy of the trust I'm inadvertently placing in them. Either way, let the money do some good in the world. I did enough harm with it. Your father, William J. Harrington. Marcus finished reading with tears in his eyes. He wanted the money to help people. He did. At the end, when he knew death was coming, he had regrets. But he never had the courage to make amends publicly. You did what he couldn't. You took his fortune and his crimes and turned them both into something positive. Ruth pulled a checkbook from her purse. My father left my sisters and me plenty of money through legitimate means. We don't need anything from the safe. But I'd like to contribute to your foundation. $1 million in my father's name. Let it help the kind of people he once exploited. Marcus tried to refuse, but Ruth insisted. Let my father's legacy be more than corruption and greed. Let it also be redemption. Please. He accepted the check, and Ruth left, leaving Marcus standing in the conference hall with $1 million donation and a new understanding of the man who'd built the Grandview. That night, Marcus called Sarah. I met Harrington's daughter today. How did that go? Better than expected. She donated $1 million to the foundation, and she gave me a letter from Harrington. He wanted the money to do good. He knew he'd done wrong and hoped whoever found it would do better. So you fulfilled a dying man's wish, Sarah said. That's heavy. Yeah, I keep thinking about him. This brilliant, cruel, complicated man who built an empire on corruption, but also felt guilty about it. I wonder what he'd think of the Grandview now. I think he'd be proud, Sarah said. You took what he built and made it matter. Isn't that what everyone wants? To matter? After hanging up, Marcus walked out onto his hotel balcony. The conference was in Chicago, far from Los Angeles, far from the farm, but under the same stars. He thought about trajectory. How 5 years ago he'd been a failing farmer. How 4 years ago he'd been a man who'd just found a fortune. How 3 years ago he'd been fighting lawsuits. How 2 years ago he'd been building a foundation. And now? Now he was someone who mattered. Not because he was rich, though he was, but because he'd chosen to use that wealth to help others. The money was almost secondary. What mattered was the choice. The final major event came 7 years after Marcus bought the Grandview. The building was being honored by the Los Angeles Conservancy as a historic landmark, permanently protected from demolition. The ceremony was held in the restored ballroom, the same space where Marilyn Monroe had danced, where soldiers on leave had celebrated, where decades of Los Angeles history had unfolded. Marcus stood with Sarah, Carlos, Roberto, and dozens of others who'd been part of the Grandview salvation. The mayor spoke about historic preservation and second chances. Architectural historians praised the restoration work. But the most moving speech came from Anna Chen, Marcus's daughter Sarah's daughter. His granddaughter, 8 years old, reading from a paper she'd written for school. "My grandpa saved this building when everyone said it was garbage," Anna read carefully. "He found treasure inside it. But the real treasure wasn't the gold or jewels. It was giving the building a new chance to matter, and giving people who needed help a chance to keep their homes and farms and dreams." She looked up from her paper. "My teacher asked what makes something treasure. I think treasure is anything that helps people. Grandpa found money treasure, but he turned it into people treasure. And that's better." The crowd applauded, many wiping tears. Marcus hugged his granddaughter, overwhelmed by how far they'd all come. After the ceremony, Marcus stood alone in the penthouse one more time. The museum was closed for the private event, and he'd slipped away from the crowd for a moment of reflection. The safe stood in its corner, door open, empty, exactly as he'd left it that first night when Carlos had finally cracked it open. Marcus put his hand on the cool metal, remembering the moment they'd first seen inside. The shock, the disbelief, the terror, and hope all mixed together. "Thank you," he whispered to the safe, to Harrington, to whatever force of luck or fate had brought him to this building on that desperate day. "Thank you for the chance to do something that matters." Footsteps behind him. Sarah joined him at the safe. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky we got. How easily it could have gone differently. If I hadn't gone to that auction. If Roberto hadn't told me about the penthouse. If Carlos hadn't been able to open the safe. Any one of those things goes wrong, and we're probably homeless right now." "But they didn't go wrong," Sarah said. "You made good choices at every step. You took the risk when it mattered. You did the right thing with what you found. That's not just luck, Dad. That's you." Marcus smiled. "Maybe it's both. Luck gives you the opportunity. Character decides what you do with it." They stood together in the penthouse as the party continued below, the Grandview alive again with celebration and purpose. 7 years ago, Marcus Chen had stood in this exact spot, terrified and desperate, holding a flashlight in the darkness, hoping against hope that the penthouse Roberto described actually existed. Now he stood here as a philanthropist, foundation director, and the man who'd given the Grandview Hotel a second life. The building that everyone said should be demolished had become a symbol of hope and second chances. The safe that everyone said couldn't be opened had revealed not just treasure, but truth. And the farmer that everyone said had made the worst decision of his life had actually made the best one. Because sometimes, when you've lost everything and you've got nothing left but hope and courage, the craziest gamble becomes the smartest bet. Sometimes the buildings everyone abandons are the ones hiding the greatest treasures. And sometimes a safe lock for 60 years is just waiting for the right person to open it and let both the money and the truth come home at last. Marcus walked to the penthouse window and looked out over Los Angeles, at the city lights stretching to every horizon. Somewhere out there were the 300 families the foundation had helped this year. The 60 families living in the Grandview's affordable apartments. The thousands of people who'd visited the museum and left inspired. He thought about Roberto, retired now and living comfortably, finally able to rest after decades of hard work. About Carlos, who'd found purpose helping run the foundation. About Sarah, who discovered her calling. About Anna, growing up in a world of possibility instead of poverty. And he thought about William Harrington, The complicated, flawed man who'd built this beautiful building and filled it with secrets, whose dying wish had been for his fortune to do some good in the world. I did it, Marcus whispered to the ghost of Harrington, to the memory of his grandfather, to his younger self sleeping in a car outside this building 7 years ago. I took the treasure and made it matter. I gave the Grandview new life. I helped people who were drowning, just like I was. I did it. And in the reflection of the window, Marcus saw himself smiling, finally at peace with the journey that had started with desperation and ended with purpose. The Grandview Hotel stood solid and beautiful beneath him, its lights glowing warm against the night sky. No longer condemned, no longer forgotten, redeemed, just like the man who'd saved it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.